Hello! In this video lecture we're going to be going over Sociology and Culture, which is Chapter 2. So let's define culture first. A culture is a complex system of meaning and behavior that defines the way of life for a given group or society. It gives people a sense of belonging, tells them how to behave and how to handle certain situations. Culture is all around us. Everything we do, what we have for breakfast, how we enjoy our leisure time, the kind of holidays we celebrate, all of these define culture. So you'll see over here in my little picture, language, medical cures. A friend of mine is Asian and she swears by acupuncture. Religion, child-rearing methods. There's some cultures that still believe in corporal punishment. What foods we eat, so an American hamburger, you go to another country like Italy and the standard is pasta. Folk art, celebrations, our jokes, manners, clothing and dress, and our work schedules. In France, there are laws about not being able to work overtime to the extent that it becomes the standard. In the United States, we have 2 weeks vacation usually when we start a job. In Ireland, they have 6 weeks vacation when they start a job. So, what's the lesson? We should all move to Ireland. So, culture also includes our beliefs, knowledge, morals, customs, language, ways of thinking, how people interact, our values, art, laws, habits, dress, patterns of behavior, and music. And when we think of culture, it's not just American culture, it's your culture in terms of your age demographic, it's your culture in terms of where you grew up. So somebody who grows up in Texas is probably going to be more likely to enjoy country music than somebody who grows up in Pennsylvania. But that doesn't mean that people in Pennsylvania don't like country music. Culture defines what is perceived as beautiful or ugly, right or wrong, good or bad. These are all examples of beautiful women from their culture. And again, this is your standard American beauty and Indian. Some of our African tribes do the lip extensions. And if you think about the piercings and tattoos that have become very popular in the last 15 years, again, it's a way of defining that you belong to a particular culture or you define what is beautiful to you. Then we have material versus non-material culture. Material culture consists of the objects created in society. So our buildings, so this is our Washington Monument, one of the phallic symbols of our government. Art, tools, toys, Barbie, huge as always, and media. These items can be collected in a museum or archives and can be analyzed for meaning. Non-material culture includes the norms, laws, customs, ideas, and beliefs of a group of people. So material means something you can hold, something you can touch, something you can pick up and move. Something like a movie can be a material culture because it is such a part of the process of manufacturing in terms of putting a movie together. So let's go over the characteristics of a culture. Culture is shared, meaning certain symbols, language patterns, belief systems, and ways of thinking are distinctly unique. So if you think about the people who live in Philadelphia, we see an eagle with green, and of course we think of our football team. You go order a cheesesteak with, because that means it's going to come with the cheese and the onions and stuff. Our belief systems in Philadelphia, come down to, in large part, our sense of identity, of who we are as a collective group. Culture is learned, Some culture is learned directly. For example, when kids are little, we teach them how to use forks and spoons, and then eventually knives, whereas in Asian countries, they're going to use chopsticks. And some culture is learned indirectly through observation and imitation. So, for example, kids often imitate their same gender parent. So you'll see a dad standing with his hands on his hips, watching a game, and his son is oftentimes a carbon copy, a miniature carbon copy, standing right next to him. Culture is often taken for granted because these practices are normal. We don't think about their uniqueness, such as wearing shorts in hot weather in the United States. You go to other countries and that is not done. In Italy, you don't see anybody in shorts. Now, you'll see girls in dresses, but generally men tend to stick to pants unless they're going to the beach. Culture is symbolic, meaning it's not inherent in a symbol, but the meaning is defined by the people who give it meaning. So, for example, we have the United States flag with its red, white, and blue, and then you have the Confederate flag that the Confederate States used during the Civil War, and it is still a bone of contention down in the South. African Americans complain that it represents a time when they were enslaved, which of course is accurate, and the Southern people who believe that the Confederate flag is part of their culture, it's part of their history, and it should be honored. One side doesn't necessarily need to be right, because culture is about what you believe. Culture varies across time and place. Culture develops as people adapt to their environment. So your era also has specific culture. People who were teenagers during the 80s and the 90s had a much different cultural experience. So this is not my prom picture, but this is pretty much what everybody looked like in the 80s when I was in high school. And then this is more of the 90s. When you get into the aughts and the teens where we are now, again, you're going to have different looks, different kinds of dresses, different styles, and a large part of that is based on how a group of people or a culture wants to define itself. So clearly in the 80s, big hair was very important and part of our identity. The culture of language. Each generation has its own slang. Each profession has its own terminology. So you talk to a lawyer and they start talking all kinds of nonsense about writs and hereto and heretofore and wherewith, and their language is just almost impossible to understand. Same thing with doctors. You have polymyositis. Well, okay, I don't know what that means. Computers, did your network card and your graphics card interact? I have no idea. It's turn it on, right? So social groups also have their own religion. So you're sitting watching a football game and they're talking about a snapback, or they're talking about how the wide receiver was not in place, or how the play didn't go down right. And if you don't know anything about football, this is completely, they might as well be speaking Swahili. Same thing with religion. You go to a Catholic church, you're standing up, you're sitting down, you're standing up, you're kneeling, you're sitting down, just trying to keep up with what's going on. And then you have them, having the body and blood of Christ in the middle of all of this. And again, if you are not someone who grew up in that culture, it seems odd, very odd. I have here also on the sides some of the slang from the 90s and from the 2000s. So, everyone's favorite, YOLO, and then things like ratchet and swag and hipster and all that kind of fun stuff. Derogatory slang. The use of racial slurs, and I have some examples: Orientals, Indians, rednecks, reinforce social patterns of inequality, especially when used in a casual way. It also emphasizes the power relationships, depending on who gets to name whom. So, when you think about any kind of scenario where someone is in a power position and they are demeaning someone else by challenging their identity, by calling them something that has a perceived negative value, they're reinforcing their power. Some groups have reclaimed these derogatory names in an effort to take the power out of them. So African Americans calling each other the N-word, and gay people using homo or dyke when talking to each other. This builds cohesiveness and solidarity within a group. So in Ireland, one of the things that Americans used to say to Irish people that was a negative was they called them mix. And so a lot of Irish people will call each other Mick almost as a nickname sometimes, because you take the sting out of it, you own it, and now you change the power dynamic. You say, yeah, that's totally me. I'm it. And that's why so many people use the N-word in the African American community, because it takes the sting or the power out of the word. Then we have norms. Norms are specific cultural expectations for how to behave in a given situation. So implicit norms are expectations that do not need to be spelled out to understand them. So for example, how to join a line of people waiting to buy tickets to a movie. You just know, you get to the end of the line and you stand there. Then we have explicit norms, which are rules governing behavior that are written down or formally communicated. So, for example, you're on 95, you're driving, and you drive by a speed limit sign that says 55. That is an explicit norm that says to you, as a driver, you should not be driving more than 55, which, of course, all of us never drive faster than that. Social sanctions are the social controls that enforce the norms. So back in the day, they would put you in the stocks in the middle of town so people could mock you. And now they just send you to jail where, worse stuff happens. Then we have taboos. Taboos are behaviors that result in the strictest of negative social sanctions. And, pretty much the big three in terms of whatever culture you live in, they follow. Tends to be incest, which is sex between family members, bestiality, which is sex with an animal, and cannibalism, where you chop up a human and have them for lunch. And, the idea here is that there are just certain natural laws or rules that are not allowable or acceptable. Whereas, of course, Miss Piggy and Kermit is totally fine because we're all about the interspecies relationships between frogs and pigs. Beliefs. Beliefs are shared ideas held collectively by people within a given culture about what is true. Shared beliefs bind people together in society, and beliefs are often the basis for norms. So if you grow up in a Christian household and everyone you count as a family member is a Christian, and then you go to school and you go to a Christian school and everybody there believes in Jesus, then that becomes a huge part of your life, because this is the collective idea that's held by the vast majority of people in your world. Then we have values, which are abstract standards in a society that define ideal principles. They define what is desirable and morally correct. So, for example, in the United States, freedom and democracy are extremely important to us. Independence. These are all terms that are, extremely American. And you go to other places, especially in Asia, and the entire concept of independence is foreign because they're such a collective group of people, working for the benefit of the group instead of working for the benefit of the self. However, even within society, these values are often debated. Things like abortion, euthanasia, and you can go all the way through the line. Gun control, our ability to get medical marijuana, all of these values are debated because we have such a diverse country in the United States that you do tend to have people on a continuum of what they believe in. So you might have somebody who is pro-gay marriage but who's against abortion. And, these values vary from person to person. Now, in the United States, we have the dominant culture. And every society has a dominant culture. And it is a culture of the most powerful group in that particular society. It is the standard by which other cultures are judged. In the United States, the dominant culture is that of white, middle class, Protestant people of Northern European descent. So the idea here is that they are the people in charge, and the rest of us are all scrapping for whatever's left. Subcultures are the cultures of groups whose values and behaviors differ to some degree from those of the dominant culture. They usually share some similar characteristics as the dominant culture, but some collection of attributes makes them stand apart from the dominant culture. So, for example, I am Irish, so I am an American, but my subculture is Irish. You could go even further, you could say that somebody is American and they're Italian and they are an Eagles fan. So again, they have these small variations in the characteristics, but the vast majority of us fall under this idea of a dominant culture. The reality is, in the United States, and this is one of the reasons why we're having such a cultural disagreement in this country with our diversity, is that the minority groups are becoming stronger and stronger and growing. So Hispanics are the fastest growing minority in the country. Soon they're going to be at about 20% of the population. African Americans has continued to remain stable at about 13 or 14%. The Indian population, not the American Indians, but the Southeast Indians, there is about 1% in this country, but they are growing and they have money. People from India in the United States make more money than your average regular old-fashioned American. So something like immigration reform, which is important to Hispanics and Asians, that's going to have to become a major issue in the next 20 years, because these are the folks who are coming in under the new rules, because back 200 years ago they didn't have immigration laws like they do now. Subculture can become mainstream. There are times that subculture's values will infiltrate the dominant culture and become part of it. For example, music styles start off being part of a subculture and are often absorbed by the dominant culture. So rap and hip-hop are now the standard for American music. This picture around here is Run DMC and Aerosmith, and they did the first collaboration many, many, many years ago between rock and rap. And now it's just a normal thing. You see it all the time. Then we get into countercultures, and you want to think of counter as being opposite. These are subcultures created as a reaction against the values of the dominant culture. Nonconformity to the dominant culture's values is the main characteristic of the counterculture. So in the 60s, we had the hippies, and the 90s, we saw a proliferation of white supremacist groups. Again, it doesn't need to be a positive or a negative. It is just what it is. So if you think about a counterculture, for example, motorcycle gangs, for a long time they were seen as the bad boys, and there are still a lot of bad boy motorcycle groups. I mean, Sons of Anarchy pretty much defines that. But there are a lot of motorcycle groups that do a lot for charity and have participated in veterans' funerals, children's funerals, in terms of protecting and giving them security on a very crazy, hectic day. So, counterculture isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it can't, but it can be. The white supremacists, pretty much nobody really thinks that's a great movement to have as a benchmark in this country. Then we have something called ethnocentrism, is when people see things only from the point of view of one's own cultural group. It leads to narrow-minded conclusions about the value of diverse cultures, and taken to extremes, it can lead to genocide or terrorism. So back in the 1930s, when Germany was dealing with economic problems, a politician named Adolf Hitler came to power because he had a message that everybody got on board with, which is, it's all the Jews' fault. And so, because everything was the Jews' fault, let's round them up and put them in camps and kill them all. So, somewhere between 6 and 12 million Jews were annihilated in 6 years. And what this tells us is that, we look around, and if you know somebody who's Jewish, you know probably that they are not going to be the cause of an entire country's problems. They're a relatively small minority in most countries. But the perspective that Adolf Hitler offered was, let's get rid of these people and all of our problems will go away. And this is what we're dealing with groups like ISIS and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda now, is that they see the United States and many countries in Europe as the enemy because we are not Muslim, or we are not following Sharia law, which is the law of real hardcore Islamists. We're not talking about your average Muslim who lives in Indonesia and has, a regular life. They go to work, they come home, they feed their kids. These folks are people who really don't see the American way of life, or even, a British way of life, as being valid. And their perspective is, let's get rid of them and we're going to save the world. Which, of course, the United States isn't a real big fan of. Then we have the influence of mass media. And this is something that you cannot underestimate how valid this is. Mass media is the communication options that are available to wide segments of the population. Anything in print, film, radio, TV, everything on the internet, everything that is available to the masses and that communicates to people. And just to kind of put this in context, 98% of American households have a television. And if you think about your own house, do you have more than one TV? Most of us, we have a tablet, we have a laptop, we can watch TV or Netflix on them. So, we're even going into that post-television concept where you don't even need a TV anymore to engage and immerse yourself in mass media. So here are some statistics about TVs. 42% of households have their television on for the majority of the day, and that means at least 13 hours a day. The average American spends 33 hours per week watching TV. So there's 7 days in a week, divided into 33, and we get almost, I know my math is I'm rounding up, 5 hours a day. And, ask yourself, is that really the time frame that you're using? Now, I will say that people in college do tend to watch less television because you're a little busy, college, school, working, minding your friends, that kind of stuff. But in general, most of us sit in front of the TV for 5 hours. And then if you have a Sunday where there's a lot of football on, you might be in front of the TV for 9 hours. Sociologists have found that people's fear of crime is directly related to the time they spend watching TV or listening to the radio. So, for example, I was watching a rerun of Criminal Minds the other day. And, of course, it's very creepy and weird and all that kind of fun stuff. So, every time I see something on TV about a group of people being killed, I'm always thinking serial killer. So, the point is that the more violence we see on television, the more we expect to see it in real life. Next point, African Americans and Hispanics watch more television than whites, yet whites account for the vast majority of characters on TV. You can watch any show, and what's that on South Park? It's the African American kid is called Token, and it's really sometimes that's how it feels. Is you have one or two African Americans who are in the background, and all the main players are actually white. And then you have shows, for example, Criminal Minds. Can you figure out that I really like that show? Where you have Shamar Moore, who has been really one of the main stars of that show for the entire run of it. Lastly, media conglomerates own the vast majority of television stations. So in a sense, popular culture has become concentrated in the hands of a few huge companies. And most people don't realize how few companies actually own all the TV stations. And here is just a general idea. We have GE, they own all the NBCs, History Channel, A&E, Bravo, Bio, USA, Sci-Fi, Telemundo, Hulu, Sundance, Hallmark Channel. Then you have Time Warner, and they own all the CNNs. They own HBO, they own Cinemax, they own Cartoon Network, the Adult Swim, TNT, TBS, TCM, True TV, CW, and these are all major television companies that all belong to the same group. Fox, of course, they own all the Fox Newses, and then they have a bunch of smaller ones. Viacom, MTV, VH1, CMT, TV Land, Spike, Nickelodeon, BET, Logo, which is for the gay network. More Nickelodeons. The Disney. This is really one of those you just can't believe how much they own. ABC, all of the ABCs, all of the ESPNs, all of the Disney channels, Lifetime, Soap Channel, and then you have some newer things that they're doing with games and gaming on for TV. CBS, Showtime, CW, CBS Sports, Flicks. And so, if you scroll through your TV options, you're going to see the vast majority of the channels listed on this slide, because these are the folks who own everything. And each of these companies has a very particular perspective and point of view that they are trying to get across. Next, we're going to talk about the reflection hypothesis. The reflection hypothesis believes that mass media reflect the values of the general population, the most broad-based audience they can attract. The concept is based on the idea that the images and values portrayed in the media influence the values of those who have seen them. Therefore, children who watch the most television have the most stereotypic idea of gender. So, if you have, for example, when I was growing up, one of the big TV shows was Brady Bunch. And the Brady Bunch, dad was an architect, mom was a stay-at-home mom, who also had a live-in maid. And, that is what I was brought up to believe was the norm. And then you start moving into different kinds of television shows. You go into something like Full House. You have 3 adult men raising 4 girls. You have other shows where this family dynamic alters and changes, but the gender defining ways they do it pretty much are pretty stereotypical. Now, culture also changes, and it changes in response to the changed conditions in society. So, for example, immigration leads to new types of restaurants, music, and stores integrating into an area. 25 years ago, you couldn't find a restaurant that served sushi. Now, you can't swing a cat without hitting a place that'll serve you sushi. So sushi is one of those things that became part of our culture now because of the influx of Asian immigrants. Culture changed through cultural diffusion, which is the transmission of cultural elements from one society or cultural group to another. And so, for example, rap and hip-hop music is now the standard, and you see this in diverse societies like the United States. If you go to a country like Saudi Arabia, which is not diverse at all, it's actually quite uniform, you're going to hear very traditional type music because you don't have necessarily the influence of outside music sources. Now, interestingly enough, the Saudi royal family, all of the daughters, the princesses, they enjoy going to Paris to buy their clothes. So what you do see is a diversity in how they dress underneath the big burqa. So underneath, they're wearing Chanel and Givenchy and Alexander McQueen, but on top, they've got the burqa. Culture change as a result of innovation, including inventions in technological developments. Think about the development of the elevator. Prior to the development of the elevator, most buildings were no more than 6 flights of stairs high because that's pretty much the max people could walk up. And the idea was the higher you were on the floor, whatever higher the floor was, you paid less rent because you had to walk up all those steps. Now, with the advent of the elevator, people want the penthouse because there's no step walking, and the penthouse is, of course, the most expensive. Think about the development of cars and how that changed things. Prior to cars, we used horses, and horses were seen as a polluting situation because horses pooped everywhere. So cars came in and they were much cleaner in terms of how they ran. They weren't pooping carbon monoxide in the sense that people could see it. Now, later we discovered it was polluting our air. But the other thing is that a horse on a good day can go about 20, 25 miles without, too much pressure. A car, most of us are driving 20, 25, 30 miles just to go to work these days. And of course, the internet, which has totally changed how we communicate, how we purchase things, how we interact online, the way we play games. Everything about our life has completely changed since the advent of the internet. Lastly, culture can be imposed. So when white settlers came to the USA, they imposed their culture on the American Indians. So Indians could no longer wear their feather headdresses. They couldn't wear their native jewelry. They forced them to wear clothes. They forced them to not learn their native languages. They forced them to learn English. They forced them to learn the American version of history and not their personal sense of history. And, when you hear about, and, there are reparations paid to Indians on a regular basis, either tax benefits, letting them have gambling licenses. It's because, the white settlers really did a number on the American Indians. So this is going to finish this chapter. If you have any questions, please text me or email me, and I hope you have a great day.